In recent days, the world has been shaken by news that, according to analysts at the Financial Times, could mark a point of no return in relations between Russia and the West. French special forces seized a vessel belonging to the so-called Russian Shadow Fleet, an entire system of ships that Moscow uses to evade sanctions and carry out covert deliveries of oil, weapons, and technology. According to insiders in Paris, the operation had been prepared for several months in coordination with NATO intelligence structures and was conducted in neutral waters, which made it especially high profile. Just hours after the vessel's seizure, the Kremlin issued a harsh statement, and Vladimir Putin, speaking at the Valdai Forum, publicly accused France of acts of piracy, comparing Paris's actions to an attack on the freedom of navigation. But behind the scenes, sources cited by the Washington Post say the Russian president was furious, and the incident became a personal blow for him. U.S. intelligence, citing satellite data and intercepted communications, reports that within the first 24 hours after the incident, Putin held a closed meeting with the Russian Navy's top command. According to insiders, several response options are being considered, from diplomatic pressure to a military show of force. Particular attention has been drawn to reports that Moscow plans to deploy several warships along the Shadow Fleet's routes, providing them with armed escorts. But if these plans are implemented, it will lead to direct contact with NATO forces, which are currently patrolling the same areas where Russian vessels operate. Bloomberg, citing sources in European diplomatic circles, reports that Paris and Brussels expected harsh rhetoric from Moscow, but were not prepared for the situation to escalate so quickly. In recent days, according to German outlets Handelsblatt and Der Spiegel, even more alarming information has surfaced. The Kremlin is considering deploying nuclear submarines to the Shadow Fleet's routes. Insiders from British intelligence claim this move is not intended for combat use, but as a political act of intimidation, a signal to demonstrate that Russia is ready to defend its vital interests at any cost. Such a step, if taken, would represent the most serious military challenge to NATO since the Cold War. The Financial Times writes that an emergency meeting is already underway at NATO headquarters in Brussels to discuss a response to what it calls Russia's nuclear signal. Within European diplomatic circles, many describe the situation as playing at the edge of disaster, since the appearance of Russian submarines near key trade routes would inevitably trigger a corresponding buildup of US and British naval forces. At the same time, Donald Trump made several contradictory statements. In a post on Truth Social, he called France's actions irresponsible and emphasized that America should not be dragged into a war for Paris's interests. However, as reported by the New York Times, there is intense debate within his inner circle. Some advisors are urging Trump to take a firm stance and support allies to demonstrate U.S. leadership, while others argue that the situation could be used to exert pressure on Europe. Russian state media, in turn, launched a large-scale campaign portraying the ship's seizure as an attack by the West on the Russian economy. Propaganda outlets claim that the Shadow Fleet is not smuggling but a legitimate way for Russia to conduct trade under unjust sanctions. Yet, as Politico notes, Western experts see it very differently. They argue that these ships provide the Kremlin with billions of dollars used to finance the war against Ukraine. The capture of one of these vessels means the West has, for the first time, directly intervened in this shadow economy, opening an entirely new chapter in the conflict. Meanwhile, insiders report that Russia has intensified negotiations with Iran and China in an attempt to secure their support. According to Japan's Kyodo News Agency, Moscow has offered Tehran to expand naval cooperation and even consider joint patrols in the Indian Ocean. China, by contrast, is taking a more cautious stance. Beijing is not interested in a direct confrontation with NATO, but according to the South China Morning Post, Chinese authorities are closely monitoring the situation, since a blow to Russia's Shadow Fleet could automatically affect China's logistical networks as well. All this is unfolding against the backdrop of ongoing pressure on the Russian economy. According to Vedomosti, Russia's budget deficit has reached record levels, while Western sanctions continue to erode revenues from oil and gas exports. In this situation, maintaining the Shadow Fleet has become a matter of survival for the Kremlin. That is why Putin's moves are becoming increasingly risky and unpredictable. The Guardian quotes a senior NATO official who said that if Russia actually deploys its nuclear submarines to the routes of the Shadow Fleet, it would be tantamount to declaring a new Cold War. Such statements reflect the level of anxiety currently gripping the West. With each passing day, the stakes continue to rise. The seizure of a single ship has triggered a chain reaction that could escalate into a global crisis. Europe fears disruptions in energy supplies. The United States fears being drawn into a new military confrontation, and Russia shows its readiness to go to extremes. Experts note that all this strongly resembles the scenarios of the 20th century, when local incidents became precursors to world wars. Today, just a few days after the French Special Forces operation, the world is once again teetering on the edge, and no one can say how it will end. According to Reuters, Moscow's actions have triggered panic across European capitals. In Paris, security around ports and oil terminals has been urgently reinforced amid fears of Russian retaliation. In Berlin, however, the response has been more restrained. The government of Friedrich Merz publicly supported France, but behind the scenes, German industrial leaders are voicing discontent as Germany remains critically dependent on maritime supplies, and any escalation at sea threatens further disruptions in energy resources. Insiders at Handelsblatt report that German businesses are increasingly pressing the government to seek a compromise with Moscow in order to avoid an economic shock. In London, the situation is different. British media report that the Royal Navy has already prepared special contingency plans. The Times, citing military sources, claims that if Russian submarines appear near European routes, British Astute-class nuclear submarines will be deployed for invisible deterrence. According to experts from the Royal United Services Institute, this creates the risk of a cat-and-mouse game underwater, where even the slightest crew error could lead to disaster. Inside the Kremlin, according to Medusa, citing sources close to Putin, divisions are growing. Some military officials demand a tough response and insist on showcasing the submarine fleet, while others believe this would lead Russia into a direct confrontation with NATO, something the country is not prepared for. According to the Washington Post, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reportedly warned Putin about the risks, but the Kremlin leader increasingly ignores such cautions, relying instead on his own political instincts. Bloomberg notes that Russian oligarchs are also alarmed. The ship's seizure has directly hit their revenues, since the Shadow Fleet facilitated oil flows that sustained gray financial schemes. Now, part of Moscow's business elite is trying to persuade the Kremlin to find secret negotiation channels with the West in order to partially restore the sanction bypassing system. But according to the Financial Times, Putin sees such proposals as a sign of weakness and believes that only force can make Europe back down. Meanwhile, the United States has taken an ambiguous position. The White House has officially expressed support for France, but according to Politico, anxiety prevails within the Pentagon. American military officials fear that any new move by Russia could force NATO to deploy additional forces, which would mean a direct confrontation. Particular concern is also caused by reports from Japan's Nikkei newspaper that Moscow is considering the possibility of forming a temporary military alliance with North Korea to increase pressure on the West. Insiders say this would involve joint exercises in the Far East and the exchange of missile system technologies. Such a move would be a clear signal to Washington that Russia is ready to expand the confrontation beyond Europe, turning it into a global crisis. On the diplomatic front, tensions are escalating. The United Nations Security Council has already held an emergency meeting at which representatives of France and the United States accused Russia of gross violations of international norms. The Russian representative, in turn, stated that the West itself behaves like a maritime pirate, and that Moscow will not allow its interests to be humiliated. But as the BBC notes, even among Russia's traditional allies, such as India, doubts are increasingly being voiced. New Delhi fears that the escalation in Europe could trigger new economic shocks that would affect global markets. Against this backdrop, analysts at Stratfor warn that we are witnessing a rare situation where a chain of mutual provocations could lead to war even without either side actively seeking it. The seizure of a single ship became the trigger, after which decisions are now being made emotionally and under time pressure. The history of the 20th century teaches that such crises most often escalate into global conflicts. Thus, The world has found itself in a state of a new maritime Cold War. Every step by Moscow or NATO is now seen as a challenge, and every silence as a sign of weakness. The longer this game continues, the greater the likelihood that a random incident, a collision between ships, a false radar signal, or a submarine error could turn into a catastrophe. As one NATO diplomat quoted by Le Monde put it, "We are walking on a knife's edge, and no one knows who will slip first."